I'm a huge fan of Neil Gaiman, and I love The Graveyard Book. Gaiman is a master world builder and master wordsmith, and when those two things come together, it creates amazing stories. In The Graveyard Book in particular, Gaiman has created a story that haunts readers. It stays with them after they've finished reading it, and they keep thinking about it and talking about it and recommending it to friends. And that's what I want for your writing. This is a channel called Ignited Ink Writing, and it's dedicated to helping you transform your stories so they linger with readers in this way. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and writer. There are two aspects of The Graveyard Book I recommend writers pay attention to when reading it. The first is the breadth of audience that Neil Gaiman manages to appeal to, and the second is the way he's using story chapters and pulling the reader along the life of the main character, Bod. The Graveyard Book is about a little boy growing up in a graveyard, hence the name, and the way that Gaiman uses these story chapters really helps get that across. First, let's look at how Gaiman appeals to such a wide audience. The Graveyard Book is written for middle grade readers, so those are people ages 9 to 12, but it really appeals to all ages, and one of the key ways Gaiman does this is by appealing to universal emotions. So, for example, in this excerpt from chapter 2, Bod is 6 years old and his main caretaker is leaving him for the first time, and this is his reaction to that. Bod had been upset by this when he first learned about it. He was no longer upset. He was furious. Bod's 6-year-old mind tried to imagine something that could make Silas want to leave him and failed. It's not fair. Most people can relate to this fear, confusion, and betrayal Bod is feeling in this passage. We've all been left behind before, and even if we haven't been the ones left behind, we've had to leave someone else. So parents can relate to this when their kid is begging them not to go on a trip, and kids can relate to this because they've had parents leave them. Everyone has or probably will feel this at some point in their lives, and most of the emotions that Bod is experiencing while growing up in The Graveyard Book are universal in this way. The other way Gaiman appeals to a wide range of readers is by merging literary readers with genre readers who like world building, fantasy and science fiction and paranormal books. And he does this by creating beautiful language while at the same time moving the story along and keeping you invested in the characters in the world. Gaiman actually won both the Newbery Award and the Hugo Award for The Graveyard Book, and the Newbery Award is for literary middle grade books. It's for books that have an excellent use of language. And the Hugo Award is for world-building books. It's for books that are fantasy, science fiction, paranormal, that take you to another world, and that give you a great, compelling story. And Gaiman did both of these things in The Graveyard Book, so he's appealing to both of these audiences, which is actually really hard to do. Literary readers generally don't like to read science fiction and fantasy, and science fiction and fantasy readers generally find literary fiction too slow-moving. In the very first chapter, Gaiman describes the graveyard, and this is one of those places I think you can see both the world building and the literary use of language coming together to create something really magical. Gaiman describes the graveyard as, you could see the funeral chapter, iron doors padlocked on the sides of the spire, a small tree growing out of the guttering at roof level. You could see stones and tombs and vaults and memorial plaques. You could see the occasional dash or scuttle of a rabbit or vole or weasel as it slipped out of the undergrowth along the path. You would have seen these things in the moonlight if you had been there that night. You might not have seen a pale, plump woman who walked the path near the front gates, and if you had seen her with a second, more careful glance, you would have realized she was only moonlight, mist, and shadow. The language that Gaiman is using in this section is deceptively simple. It's the vocabulary of a middle grade reader, but at the same time, the way he's putting the words together creates a rhythm that pulls you along and that creates a vivid image. While Gaiman is setting the scene in this way, he's also introducing the main setting and introducing a key character, and so he's moving the plot along at the same time. By doing both those things at once, Gaiman is appealing to literary and genre readers. He's appealing to readers who really want an elegant use of language and readers who want a good story that's going to keep moving and keep them invested. The other reason the graveyard is such an important setting other than being the title of the book, is everyone can relate to a graveyard because we've either seen it on TV or we've been to one ourselves, and so it's a physical place in our world that we can go to, and it'll appeal to readers who want that reality. At the same time, it's a magical place. We have all sorts of mythology and stories based around graveyards in our society, and Gaiman is appealing to readers who like that magic as well. So the Graveyard Book bridges this gap between these two readers and meets them both in the middle, and still creates a fabulous story. So when you're choosing the setting for your kind of urban fantasy, I guess you could call it, story, think about that. Think about how can you appeal to both readers who love that magic and maybe to readers who don't like it that much. What setting can you choose that will merge those people? The second key aspect of the Graveyard Book that I think writers should pay attention to is how Gaiman is putting the stories together in individual chapters. So, chapters as stories. The main character in the Graveyard Book is Bod, and the Graveyard Book takes place over the span of his childhood. So each individual chapter highlights Bod at a different age and experiencing and learning something key at that age. So in the first section I read, Bod was 6, and he was having his main caregiver leave for the first time, and he was angry and having to deal with that. Now I'd like to read a section from a later chapter when Bod's 11, and he's again mad at Silas. See if you can see the difference in his voice at different ages. "Or what?" said Bod, his cheeks burning. "What would you do to keep me here? Kill me?" And he turned on his heel and began to walk down the path that led to the gates and out of the graveyard. I don't think Bod at 6 would have said, "Will you kill me?" But Bod at 11 definitely would. Here we're seeing the difference between an upset 6-year-old and a rebellious, independent 11-year-old. So we're getting to see how Bod is growing and changing over time and developing as a person and as a character. And what's really important is in both of these sections, Bod's voice and the words that he's choosing to use in his dialogue are appropriate for his age and for his character. That's not easy to do, and Gaiman does it really well. So I recommend if you have a character who is growing up in your story, read the Graveyard Book to see how Gaiman handles that changing character voice. Story chapters are great for that sort of a story. They're also really good if you have a large chunk of time where a character isn't changing, but the world around them is. Then you can use these story chapters to highlight how that world is changing and how the character isn't. The danger of story chapters is a reader might feel so satisfied at the end of the chapter that they don't continue reading the book because the story is done in their eyes. What Gaiman does, and what I recommend you do if you're using story chapters, is create a through thread that's going to pull the reader through the chapters. And even though that story is done, you still want to know about this thing that hasn't been tied up yet. In the Graveyard Book, that is the man Jack. And this is kind of the main threat to Bod throughout the book, even though for most of the book it's kind of off in the distance. We do get to see the man Jack in the very first scene, and we know he's a threat in the very first scene. And this is the through thread that Gaiman uses to pull the reader along through each individual story chapter. The through thread is easiest if it's a threat because there's this ominous presence and this suspense and tension building, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a mystery or some curiosity that the reader wants to find out more about and that your characters are experiencing. As long as it's present through most of the story chapters, it'll pull your reader through the story so that they don't stop at the end of a chapter. Reasons I want to recommend books to read as a writer on this channel is because I think as people we're really good at picking out what's not working, and so we're really great at reading a book that we don't particularly care for and be like, oh well, they did this wrong and I didn't like that, and they were doing this faux pas in writing and that's why this book wasn't working for me. It's a lot harder to stop in the middle of a book you're enjoying and say, why am I enjoying this? What's the writer doing so well that's pulling me along, that's sucking me into the story and making me so invested? So I challenge you to read the Graveyard Book in this way and to look at what Gaiman is doing well. And the next time you read a book that you absolutely love, read it again and see why. What is that author doing that's so appealing to you? What are they doing so well? What are the techniques that they're using? Gaiman does this by using universal emotions that can appeal to most readers. He chose the graveyard setting that appeals to both readers who love magical other worlds and readers who like to be grounded in our reality. He also used story chapters to show Bod's voice changing over time, and he had a through thread that made sure that readers would continue reading even though each chapter is its own contained story. I want your book to haunt and linger with readers the way the Graveyard Book did for me. This is why I created this channel, Ignited Ink Writing, so if you want more videos like this, please subscribe. Also, if you enjoyed this video, if you found it helpful, let me know by liking. And if you have any comments about the Graveyard Book or want to recommend a book that you loved to me, I would love to hear about that in the comments. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and writer, and now it's time for you to go and ignite your ink.